Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I'm glad you've joined me today. Make sure you are following and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, and share this episode with your family and friends. I have a great topic that's coming up. I want to talk about the judicial branch of government and what's going on within the court system. But before I get to that, keep the feedback coming for America's Founding series that I began releasing last week, and I'm so glad that many of you enjoyed the episode on Filippo Mazzi. Remember, this is going to be a weekly release, and I have a great episode lined up for this Thursday, and I'm going to talk about another forgotten patriot, but I'm not going to tell you who it is. You're going to need to tune in to find out, so that's why you want to subscribe and follow the podcast and keep the feedback coming. I really enjoy reading it, and as I said in the first release of America's Founding series, if there is a founding father, a patriot that you want me to talk about, shoot me an email, podcast@pasreport.com, podcast@pasreport.com. Now, getting to today, we're diving into one of the biggest threats that we face as a constitutional republic, and that's judicial activism. There are judges on the bench who have gone well beyond their intended role, and it's not like they're simply interpreting the law. And this has become a big problem. Instead, they're actively trying to shape policy, and that's not what the judges are supposed to be doing. Rather than follow the Constitution, their rulings are being based on their personal ideologies, the political ideology, and this undermines both executive authority and congressional power. The judicial branch is not there to make law or enforce law. And it's a problem because our system of government was carefully crafted. It was designed with a delicate balance of power, one that is being completely thrown off course by these activist judges. And if we don't get a handle on it now, if we don't confront this growing issue, it's going to continue, and it will erode the constitutional authority of the elected branches of government. There are some judges who prefer to push their ideology, and if that's the case, they should run for office. They should run to sit in Congress. They should run for the presidency of the United States. You know, they want to turn our system of self-governance into one that's ruled by judicial fiat, and that's not their role. If that's what they want to do, then run for office, become an elected official. Now, for those of you that may not know what exactly judicial activism is, it's simple. It's when judges go beyond interpreting the law and instead create new policies through their rulings. And this happens when courts override legislative intent. It happens when courts impose new legal standards that are not found in existing law, or they block a president's ability to execute a law as it was written by Congress. And when it comes to executive authority, judicial activism occurs when a courts interfere with the president's ability to enforce immigration laws like they're doing, to remove executive branch employees like they're doing, or to implement certain national security policies. These actions fall squarely within the executive branch. They're squarely within the president's constitutional powers. And unfortunately, the political views, rather than following the text of the law, is a threat that we have to confront, because judicial restraint is what's needed in the courts. And judicial restraint means sticking to the original intent of the law, respecting the roles of the executive and legislative branches, knowing the role of the judicial branch, where judges should interpret the law, not try and make the law. We have a separation of powers for a reason, and to understand why this is so dangerous, we have to look at the separation of powers that the framers of the Constitution wanted. They deliberately divided power among the three branches of government. In Federalist 47, Madison argued that all powers concentrated in the same hands, legislative, executive, judicial, is your very definition of tyranny. And they wanted to prevent any one branch of government from becoming too powerful. The legislative branch, Congress, is the one that makes laws. The executive branch, that's headed by the president, is the one that enforces law and is the chief executive officer of the United States. And the judicial branch, the courts, interpret the laws. Each branch exists to exercise different powers and to fulfill different philosophical purposes to ensure that we have a government that is accountable to the people. And it's also designed to create conflict within the government and between the branches, which is a good thing. It's a beautiful thing. You know, people don't appreciate how our founders institutionalized conflict to make it a slow, awkward, and inefficient system where the three branches of government are constantly going to battle it out, where the Senate and the House will battle. The executive branch does battle. The federal versus state governments do battle with each other. This conflict is necessary. It's one of the biggest safeguards that's been built into the system, and the courts are undermining that because they were never meant to create policy. That is the job of elected officials, and when unelected judges start making decisions that override executive authority or congressional intent, they are disrupting the balance, and it undermines democratic processes. It's the same with unelected bureaucrats. You know, we have to safeguard the system, and the framers built in a system of checks and balances to make sure that no branch of government exceeds its constitutional authority. Congress can pass laws, but the president can veto them. The courts can review laws, but they don't have the power to make them. The president can issue executive orders, but Congress controls the funding of the departments and agencies, and every branch is supposed to act as a check on another branch. But here's the problem. When the judiciary oversteps its role, and it starts to dictate to the president what the president must do, when it starts to override Congress, there are very few checks on their power, unlike elected officials. See, judges don't face voters. They can't be held accountable in the same way that a member of Congress or the president can. And when activist judges rule based on their personal ideologies rather than the Constitution, they are distorting the system. Not only are they distorting the system, they're consolidating the power in an unelected branch of government. And this isn't about Trump. I want to make that clear. Not everything has to be about Trump. This isn't even about Republicans or Democrats, because for all you Democrat listeners out there, you wouldn't want conservative judges doing this to push conservative policies, to make conservative policies from the bench. It's about preserving our constitutional system as intended by the framers. And if judges can block a president from enforcing immigration law or terminating employees, if the judges can strip Congress of its authority because they get to rewrite legislation from the bench, then we don't have a functioning constitutional government. We have a judiciary that has seized power it was never meant to have in the first place. And that's why in this episode, we're going to break down specific cases where activist judges have gone too far. They've gone well beyond their boundaries, and we'll expose how they are eroding executive authority and overriding Congress. We'll talk about what can be done to rein in this out-of-control judiciary before it's too late. So let's get started here. And the judiciary role, it's to interpret law. It's not to dictate executive policy. Yet over the course of the last several weeks, activist judges have inserted themselves into decisions that clearly fall within the president's constitutional authority, whether it's national security, federal employment, immigration enforcement, on a number of issues. These judges have blocked President Trump from carrying out his duties as the chief executive officer of the United States. And understand, I've said it many times on this podcast, I am not someone who blindly defends executive orders. I don't like executive orders. I have consistently criticized the overuse of executive orders. And I've criticized both Democratic administrations and Republican administrations. Now, when we look at the current president, I've spoken out on some of his executive actions. You know, he just put out an executive order at the end of last week about dismantling the Department of Education. He does have the right to reorganize the Department of Education. He does have the right to pare down its operations. However, only Congress has the authority to remove the Department of Education as a cabinet-level position. Only Congress can eliminate the Department of Education despite what the president wants to do, despite his roadmap to dismantle it. There are clear constitutional boundaries on executive power. There are constitutional boundaries on legislative power and judicial power. Now, when it comes to the courts overriding the current president, when it comes to a president's legitimate authority, particularly in areas explicitly granted to the executive branch of government, that's where these judges are no longer upholding the law. They're trying to make the law. And the first case I want to look at is in regards to President Trump's transgender military ban, because you have U.S. District Judge Anna Reyes, who blocked the policy from being implemented and ruled in that Trump's order likely violates the Constitution, but she doesn't really say why. She says that the administration hasn't provided evidence that banning them serves a legitimate purpose. But then she went further, and that's the key. Because when she went further, she revealed the true intent. She revealed how it was about ideology. She stated that the policy was, quote, soaked in animus and dripping with pretexts, and that the order uses derogatory language to target a vulnerable group, end quote. Now, her claims are not based on any constitutional grounds. It's speculation and conjecture. She assigns subjective intent that the Trump administration is operating in bad faith without backing it up with any evidence whatsoever. The Trump administration clearly justified the policy by citing military readiness, deployability, medical costs, not hostility towards transgender individuals. And the Supreme Court has ruled time and time again. I mean, the last case was in 2018 that courts should not assume bad intent, that the court should not assume animus or bad faith in the executive policies without clear evidence beyond political rhetoric. And that's exactly what Judge Reyes' order does. Judicial review should focus on whether there is a rational basis for policy, not whether a judge finds it offensive or politically incorrect. That's completely irrelevant what she thinks. And Judge Reyes' argument that the policy likely violates the Constitution because it didn't provide a, quote, legitimate military purpose is also backwards. The government doesn't need to prove a compelling military necessity for every personnel policy that they have. And we saw this in Rostger versus Goldberg, which upheld that male-only draft registration is okay. It's constitutional. Selective service, it's only males. And the Supreme Court looked at it and said, because military decisions are entitled to great deference, that they get to make this policy. As Commander-in-Chief, the President has broad constitutional authority under Article 2, Section 2 to set military service policy. The President can restrict who can serve. Trump isn't the first president to use this power. Historically, presidents routinely established eligibility requirements based on physical, medical, and psychological fitness. And there's no federal law that exists on the books that explicitly guarantees transgender individuals the right to serve. Military policies fall under the Department of Defense, which is an executive branch function. And the Commander-in-Chief can modify it as he sees fit. The President oversees the military. And our military routinely excludes individuals based on factors that impact readiness. It's not just about readiness. It's about unit cohesion. Military service is not a right, and in the Goldman versus Weinberger case, the Supreme Court upheld that military policies should not be judged on civilian constitutional standards. And then we have the case Gilligan versus Morgan, where the Supreme Court established that the judiciary has no role in managing or overseeing military affairs under Article 2 powers. So clearly, Judge Reyes overstepped her boundaries. And when you dig deeper into Judge Reyes' background, you actually find something really interesting. You find that she has a long history of left-wing activism. She's given over $38,000 since 2008 to Democrat causes, to far-left causes and issues. She's maxed out campaign contributions to Democrat Senator John Ossoff. She maxed out campaign contributions to President Biden's presidential campaign in 2020. And I am sure, I will bet, that she probably made significant contributions to the Kamala Harris campaign in 2024. Now, it's not that she can't engage in liberal causes. It's not like she can't provide support to Democratic candidates. And just because she makes donations doesn't mean that she's necessarily biased. She has every right to do that. And I would guarantee that there are a number of Republican and conservative judges that give to Republican and conservative causes. They give to Republican and conservative candidates. However, when you do that, it does open up questions about judicial impartiality and whether her rulings are driven by legal principles or political motivations. It opens up questions. See, this is one of the reasons that I never donate to candidates or political causes. While I am an admitted conservative, that's not a secret, as a professor, it's important for my students to know that I am not financially vested in any political candidate, in any political opinion, in any political issue. And the reason that it's important that they don't see that I'm financially vested in a political party is because it opens up questions to my impartiality in the classroom. And it's not like my students would ever check, right? I mean, let's be honest about this. You're not going to get 18 to 25-year-old students that are going to look into to see where I contribute money. But the fact that it's public information and they can is the reason that I live by this code. And it's not just when we look at the transgender military ban. If we look at another case, you have U.S. District Judge Adma Albelson blocking President Trump's executive orders that end government support for DEI programs. Judge Abelson stated that, quote, the orders likely carry constitutional violations, including against free speech rights, end quote. The Trump administration argued that they were targeting DEI programs that violate federal civil rights law. Now, when we look at the diversity, equity, inclusion beast that has been built, this billion-dollar DEI industrial complex, the judge sat there and stated that Trump's orders were generally vague. But isn't DEI generally vague? I mean, let's be honest here. DEI is whatever the social justice warriors deem it to be. It's a political agenda. It's not about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's about pushing a political ideology. It's about pushing what they deem as social justice policies. It's however they want to interpret it. And if the money was appropriated by Congress for these DEI programs, well, then the judge may have a point that the president violated his constitutional boundaries. The president doesn't have the authority to usurp congressional power in determining how money is spent. But that's not the case here. The fact is that a lot of this money, 99% of this money, is allotted to executive agencies and departments through discretionary spending, and they get to determine how the money is spent. Take the National Science Foundation, for an example. When President Biden took office, just 0.29% of the National Science Foundation grants funded DEI programs. But throughout his presidency, the number ballooned. 27% of National Science Foundation grants went to fund DEI programs. Now, Congress never mandated a 25% increase in DEI grants from the National Science Foundation. This is something the National Science Foundation was the one that they decided, not Congress. And since the president is the chief executive, ultimately the president is in charge of the National Science Foundation. He has the authority to set priorities for how those funds are allotted within the agency. And if an executive agency decides to divert a significant portion of its budget toward a political agenda like DEI without congressional direction, then the president absolutely has the right to step in and course correct. This is not about infringing on free speech in any way. Anyone can say what they want about DEI. It's about taxpayer dollars being funneled into ideological pet projects pushed by bureaucrats, pushed by far-left organizations. And what these rulings reveal is a pattern where activist judges are not simply interpreting the law, they are actively shaping policy from the bench. Whether it's Judge Reyes interfering in military policy, Judge Abelson attempting to dictate how executive agencies allot the funds, these rulings are not grounded in the Constitution. They are grounded in political ideology and nothing more. And the courts are essentially telling the sitting president of the United States that he cannot exercise his authority as commander-in-chief and the chief executive officer of the United States. That is dangerous. Again, this isn't about Trump. This has been going on for years. And next segment, we're going to take a closer look at two more cases. One where a judge overturned Trump's decision to terminate probationary federal employees, and another where a judge outright halted deportations. Once again, undermining executive authority. So last week, you had U.S. District Judge James Boasberg order the Trump administration to immediately halt all deportations conducted under the Alien Enemies Act, and he demanded that any individuals already deported be returned to the United States. This case has become a political firestorm. This case is highly controversial, and for good reason. Now, obviously, the left and right is going to disagree on why it became controversial, but when the judge issued his ruling, a deportation flight carrying illegal criminal aliens was already in the air heading to El Salvador. Judge Boasberg was furious. He claimed that the Trump administration defied a court order, that it's a constitutional crisis. But here's the problem. His order, first of all, came on a Saturday. It was a verbal order with no prior notice whatsoever, and the judge in the verbal order said it took effect immediately. How is the administration supposed to comply in real time with an order that hadn't even been written down yet, that the administration didn't even know what the real order was? It takes time for an order to make its way up the chain of command, to get to the Secretary of Homeland Security, to get to the Secretary of State, to get to the President of the United States. Yet, instead of recognizing the logistical impossibility of the judge's demand, he decided to escalate the tensions. Now, it would be nice if judges got this angry and expressed this level of outrage when the FBI illegally accessed the NSA's repository on Americans on multiple occasions. It would be nice if the courts got this outrage when they caught the FBI manipulating the FISA court over 250,000 times. But no, this level of outrage is only reserved for stopping the deportation of criminal illegal aliens because it's a Trump order. And so it raises a bigger question. Does a district court judge even have the authority to override the executive branch's enforcement of immigration law and the implementation of the Aliens Enemy Act? Especially when those people that are being deported are members of a violent transnational gang. And you have some legal scholars out there saying, well, this is a constitutional crisis, right? We're in a constitutional crisis. The Trump administration's defiance of the courts, it poses a great threat to the republic. Where were these scholars when President Biden openly defied the Supreme Court's ruling on student debt cancellation? Where were these scholars when President Biden openly mocked the Supreme Court and ignored them when it came to the mortgage moratorium? The hypocrisy is astounding. The real controversy lies in President Trump's invocation of the Aliens Enemy Act to deport Venezuelan gang members from Tren de Aragua. Now, first, the U.S. Constitution does grant the president broad authorities to enforce federal laws, including those related to immigration. Second, the Trump administration has designated TDA an international terrorist organization, and therefore they can be subjected to the Aliens Enemy Act. If Congress doesn't like it, well, then Congress can pass a law and change it. But as of right now, the law is what it is. What if it was members of Al-Qaeda or ISIS? Would anyone argue that they are not alien enemies? Would anyone argue that they are not subjected to the Alien Enemies Act? Not for nothing, but TDA has committed some horrendous crimes, including rape, human and sex trafficking, drug trafficking, even murder. They tried to take over apartment complexes in Colorado, and they spread rapidly throughout the United States thanks to Biden's open border policies, and yet many of them are now rushing to defend these criminals, claiming that they have a right to remain in the United States. No, they don't. They illegally entered the United States. They committed crimes in the United States, and we have every right to deport them back to either their native country, but if their native country is not going to accept them, we could take them into another place. And this case highlights how Judge Boasberg isn't infringing on the president's role just as commander-in-chief. He's also interfering in foreign policy. And as the chief diplomat of the United States, Trump is the one that gets to make foreign policy. This was a deportation arrangement with El Salvador. It was negotiated, and a foreign policy agreement was made between two nation states. And it was aimed at preventing these criminals from being released back into Venezuela. And if we forced the Maduro regime to accept them, Maduro would have simply sent them right back to the United States, let them go and give them the access to try and get back to the United States. So we clearly see another example of a judge attempting to dictate policy that rightfully belongs to the executive branch. And it's going to be really interesting to see how this case plays out. But this ruling is a clear example of judicial overreach, and I suspect it's going to be overturned by the higher courts. The next case I want to look at is another example of judicial overreach, and this time it's about federal employment. You have District Court Judge William Alsup, who ruled that the Trump administration must reinstate over 25,000 federal employees who were terminated during their probationary period. The judge claimed that the firings were illegal. And you had District Court Judge Amy Berman Jackson, who is another Trump hater, issue a temporary restraining order that blocks the Trump administration from any further firings of federal employees. Now, this decision goes right to the heart of the president's role as the chief executive officer of the United States. The president oversees the entire executive branch. The president has that responsibility. And this includes power to remove employees who are either not meeting performance standards or who are not needed anymore by the federal government. I mean, just think about it logically. You look at the hiring over the Biden years within the federal apparatus. When President Biden goes out there, or former President Biden goes out there and touts the job numbers, most of those jobs were created in two industries. One was government, the other one was healthcare. And the numbers continually get revised down for the private sector jobs. When it comes to probationary employees, understand they do not have the same civil service protection as permanent government workers. And I want to make something clear. You know, when we look at civil service and civil service rules, if people are laid off, the government has the right to lay off workers, even if they are civil service employees. If the government is downsizing an agency or department, whether it's at the federal, state, or local level, employees get excess. They get laid off. So even civil service employees are still subjected to termination in certain ways. But they do have some protection, civil service employees. Probationary employees don't have any protections. The probationary period exists for a reason. No one has a constitutional right to a federal job. And if the president and his administration determine that these individuals should not continue in their positions, that we have too many federal workers, that decision should not be subjected to judicial interference. I mean, President Clinton laid off something like 350 to 400,000 federal employees. Did the courts ever stop him? Did the courts ever interfere when Clinton was doing that? When Clinton determined that the era of big government was over? The idea that a district court judge can dictate federal employment decisions is absurd. And while it's never fun to watch people get laid off, we have to understand that the Constitution vests executive power in the president, not in unelected bureaucrats. And if we want to close our deficit, if we want to potentially start balancing a budget and generating surpluses, there are going to be federal employees that lose their jobs, and it's horrible for them and their families. I get that. But at the same time, again, when we look at how the government has grown throughout the last several years, I mean, the federal bureaucracy has grown tremendously. And it's still operating as if we're in a pandemic, even though the pandemic ended a few years ago. Now, Congress does have the authority to pass civil service protections, but probationary employees do not have the job security. And courts are inserting themselves into this process. This not only disrupts the functioning of the executive branch, it creates a dangerous precedent going forward where the judges will determine who is allowed to be employed by the federal government and who is not. The judges will determine and decide how the government workforce is managed. If this ruling stands, it will severely weaken the president's ability to hold federal employees accountable, and it weakens the ability for the government to manage itself. This is another example of the courts overstepping their boundaries and undermining our Constitution. But it's not the only troubling trend. And in the final segment, I'm going to discuss why judicial activism is growing worse, what can be done about it, and why it's essential that we restore judicial restraint before the courts try and reshape the entire balance of power in our government. So hang tight, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the P.A.S. Report podcast. So we've been talking a lot about judicial activism and overreach. And the bottom line is that if a president can't make decisions regarding personnel, if a president can't access federal databases within the federal departments and agencies, if a president can't reorganize agencies like USAID and Department of Education, if the president can't direct discretionary spending, and if the president doesn't direct military policy, if the president can't even lay off probationary federal employees, then I'd like someone to explain to me, what exactly can a president do? At what point does the president simply become a figurehead within the government? If the president doesn't have any of these powers, why even waste time holding elections? Why even elect the president of the United States? These activist judges are creating a system where the executive branch is going to be paralyzed, unable to carry out its constitutional duties because the judges believe they know better and that they should have the final say on governing the United States. We also know that this is more about Trump than the actual Constitution. Now, how do I know that? Well, I want you to consider a Harvard Law Review study regarding injunctions that halt presidential policies. And let's take a look at the last 5 administrations. There were 6 injunctions against the Bush administration. There were 12 injunctions against the Obama administration. There were 64 injunctions against the first Trump administration. 64. There were 14 against the Biden administration. And already in the second Trump term, there's 15. So if you look at it, you're talking about 79 injunctions against Trump, and he hasn't even served a full 8 years. It's astounding. He's only been in office for 2 months, and there's 15 injunctions against him. And I guarantee you that when it comes to his executive order about paring down the Department of Education, we're going to get to 16. Guarantee that. Now, I am not someone who believes in unchecked executive power, and I support an extremely limited presidential authority. I firmly believe that power should be diffused among the many within Congress. That's why Congress exists. It's also why the Founding Fathers gave Congress the most checks on the other 2 branches of government. If we look at the checks on the judicial branch only has judicial review, and they were the ones that created that. The executive branches has a few checks on Congress and the courts, the power of appointment, veto power over the legislative branch, can call Congress into extraordinary session, can end congressional session. But they don't have that much. Congress has the most checks on the other 2 branches. But what these district court judges are doing goes beyond constitutional checks and balances. They are actively infringing on the president's ability to govern. And I do believe that the higher courts are going to overturn many of these rulings. But the question is, how much damage gets done in the process? And where does this take us going forward? Because if they're pushing the boundaries now, well, we don't know what the country's going to look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. So while I do believe that the higher courts will overturn these rulings, and they're going to correct some of the judicial overreach that we've seen from these activist judges, the part that aggravates me is the fact that it even has to get there in the first place. Judges should be able to put their ideology aside. Judges are trained. They're trained to be neutral arbiters of the law, to look at the evidence and the arguments presented and render a decision. That's it. Not to give their political opinions. And when people say, well, the president isn't a king, I agree, the president is not a king. But when we look at President Trump and what he's doing, whether you love him or hate him, look at what he's doing. He's actually weakening the executive branch's power, and that's a good thing. I just hope Congress codifies much of the things that he's doing. This way, no future administration can reverse it. I want you to think about it logically. If you cut government spending, if you terminate bureaucrats, if you're downsizing agencies, if you remove regulatory bloat, you are shrinking the power of the executive branch. You're not expanding it. And the same people who constantly warn about Trump being a dictator and the death of democracy, they're now fighting for a strong executive branch, but not an executive branch that's actually controlled by the president of the United States. They're calling for a strong executive branch that's controlled by unelected bureaucrats. bureaucrats who are nameless and faceless, bureaucrats that have abused their power time and time again and haven't been held accountable. They want to keep the bureaucracy. This is not about Donald Trump, as I keep on saying, and I completely disagree with Trump's call and Republicans' calls to impeach judges. Let me warn all you Republicans and conservatives out there that, first of all, that's unconstitutional in and of itself. Impeachment is not supposed to be used for ideological purposes. Chief Justice Roberts criticized the president's comments, and conservatives unleashed on him. They unleashed against him. And I understand their frustration with Chief Justice Roberts. But it would be wise for Republicans and conservatives to realize if you begin to impeach judges on ideological grounds, what do you think Democrats are going to do when they get back into power? Do you think Republicans are going to remain in power forever? Are you that naive? Think about how this could easily backfire and be weaponized against constitutional originalist judges when Democrats get back into power. Think about all the calls that Democrats have made to expand the Supreme Court. So impeachment should be off the table. You don't weaponize impeachment for ideological purposes. We saw that done against Trump, and just because they did it against Trump doesn't mean that we do it against them. Okay? Now, in regards to Chief Justice Roberts, he needs to lead. And he needs to publicly rebuke these judges. He doesn't have the powers to punish these judges, but he can rebuke them publicly in the decisions they make. And he can get the Supreme Court together and immediately suspend the orders of these judges. And he should do that. Also, Congress can play a role here. Rather than impeaching judges, Congress should consider censoring these judges. A censure is warranted. These judges are overstepping their constitutional boundaries. And so the rulings that they are making undermine the separation of powers. And that's where I believe that Congress should issue the censure, putting it on record. And while the judiciary must remain independent, when judges are substituting their political ideology for legal interpretation, it threatens the integrity of the entire system. It's about the balance of power in our government, and whether the courts will be allowed to dictate policy rather than interpret the law. If the trend continues, you're going to see future presidents, Republican or Democrat, handcuffed, limited in what they could do. You're going to see a bureaucracy that runs wild and does whatever it wants, serves as the fourth branch of government that it seems to have become, the deep state. And we're going to see that the most basic functions we thought a president has, well, then they really don't. And what's that going to look like? If we're in a war, are we going to have judges ruling on battlefield plans, on military strategy and tactics? Think about how dangerous this is. Think about the dangerous precedent that's being set. And if we care about the Constitution, if we care about constitutional governance, we have to address it. We have to speak out about it. And we have to be informed. So I hope you found this episode informative. And if you did, go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify, leave the P.A.S. report a 5-star rating, take 30 seconds to write a good review. That always helps the podcast. And make sure that you share this episode. Share it with your family and friends. I have a great guest that's going to be coming on Wednesday. I have a great episode lined up for the America's Founding series that you're not going to want to miss. Again, keep the feedback coming. I really enjoy your thoughts on these issues. Podcast@PASreport.com, podcast@PASreport.com. Make sure you visit the PAS Report website, PASreport.com. And I want to thank you for tuning in to the PAS Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at PAS Report.